Good afternoon, everyone. It's so nice to be here. I'm Emily Bennett. You saw a bit of me earlier on. I'm a consultant clinical psychologist. I work at the Nottingham Children's Hospital, and I'm also very fortunate to be the chair for the National ABI in Learning and Education Syndicate, known as Enables. So I'm delighted to be here this afternoon to chair a session specifically focused on childhood brain injury and education. And before we get started, I just wanted to give you a little bit of an introduction to Enables, so you know a little bit about us as a group. We were a group who were formed on the back of the Time for Change report in 2018. And really our vision is focused on improving support for children and young people with an acquired brain injury so that they receive the correct support that they need in their education to maximise their participation and also their potential in that setting. And I think this is really a crucial area because for children, education is their occupation, isn't it? They spend a really large proportion of their time in school, and actually we know that schools can be really great rehab settings when they get it right for children. So we really need to spread the word about that. A particular focus for Enables, therefore, is really to help educators, to help policymakers and also other professionals really understand what it means and what the unique challenges are for children who have a brain injury when their brain is still developing. And that's where, childhood brain injury is very different to an adult brain injury. And finally, the other thing that I wanted to mention is, and perhaps most importantly really, is that the work of Enables is very much guided by our young experts by experience and our education professionals advisory groups. And they really help us to make sure that our focus remains on the things that those with lived experience feel matters the most in this context. So I'm going to hand over to a number of people today for the symposium who will be sharing some information about this area, and members of our special interest groups are involved as well. So delighted now to move on to introduce the speakers. And I would like to first up welcome Dr. Hope Kent to the stage. She's going to be speaking about her research into the eChild data and what this tells us about the special educational needs for children with an acquired brain injury.
Thank you. Lovely. Thank you so much, Emily. This is honestly such an exciting symposium, and I'm really pleased to be a part of it. So thanks for having me. As Emily said, I'm presenting some research today that I've been doing using the eChild dataset. This is very much a work in progress. So there's probably lots of things that you'll look at and think, oh, why haven't you done this yet? But also that means I'd really love to hear from you afterwards and things as well. Please do catch me if there's any comments or anything like that, because this is still something that's going on, so we can still explore more in this data. I am just obliged to note that this work is using data held by the Office for National Statistics, which belongs to NHS England and the Department for Education. My study findings don't imply the endorsement of any of those bodies, so I just have to note that. But I also just want to note that I'm grateful to ADI UK for funding this work through the Economic and Social and Medical Research Councils, as well as to UKABIF for their support with the project, and particularly Enables, who've been fantastic all the way through with lots of advice and guidance. I've also got 3 wonderful mentors up there as well, who have been brilliant all the way through too. Okay, so why is it important to think about educational outcomes after acquired brain injury? You're all experts in acquired brain injury, so I don't need to go through the difficulties that can arise after an acquired brain injury with you, but there are some particular difficulties which can mean that mainstream classrooms can become very inaccessible for children with brain injury. So in particular, children may have difficulties with cognition, including skills related to learning and paying attention, as well as emotional functioning, communication, speech and language needs, and also fatigue, this kind of really chronic exhaustion that's not the same as tiredness and not associated with lack of sleep, but can have a big impact on children in the classroom who are trying to concentrate on things. And because ABI is sometimes accompanied with physical disability, but not always, it can be this hidden disability, that means that often these needs might not be recognised as being associated with ABI. Teachers may not make that link, particularly if children have just been discharged from hospital without that longer term follow-up and care plan around them. And as a result, these behaviours can be misattributed in the classroom. So teachers may think children are just not paying attention, not trying very hard, or misbehaving. And as a result, children can get drawn into more difficulties at school. There are all these pressures in the classroom to communicate appropriately with peers, but differently with teachers and be more respectful, to regulate emotions, to concentrate for long periods of time, all of those things that create these barriers. And when these difficulties aren't recognised, we think this can lead to school exclusion and children being punished for not behaving the appropriate way in the classroom if support's not provided. But there's also a question about, even if support is provided, we know that children with special educational needs are overrepresented in our school exclusion statistics. They make up about 15% of the school population, but just under half of school exclusions. So it's not even definite that that support is working and is being protective of those outcomes. We also know that education professionals often have poor knowledge and understanding of ABI. I know Joanna's going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but that's a really important point. And some of our work has sort of explored the school-to-prison pipeline for children with neurodisability as well. So if children have ABI, it's not recognised, not supported, they get excluded from school, punished, pushed away from the mainstream of society. And we know that lots of children who end up in young offenders institutes, for example, have got an ABI. So something must be going wrong earlier in their journey for them to end up there. So there are some really key gaps in understanding, and lots of these were highlighted in the Time for Change report. The first is that we have this really patchy, poor incidence data for paediatric ABI. It's a really complex umbrella condition. There's lots of conditions underneath that umbrella that will lead to an ongoing ABI that mean it's quite difficult to group together and piece together. And as a result, it often gets left out of studies. I know researchers who are working on neurodisability, including things like cystic fibrosis and spina bifida, but don't include ABI in their studies because it's too difficult. It's too difficult to piece together. It's too difficult to understand which conditions will lead to ABI. And that's a problem. We also heard from Jennifer earlier on the economic report about how she had to include brain tumour, stroke, and TBI, but there wasn't much data on the other conditions, so it wasn't possible to include it. So we need better data. There's also this problem in the education system that ABI is not a special educational needs category. And that means that when teachers are supporting somebody with an ABI, they have to just pick another category in the school census that records that information. And as a result, we can't track outcomes for children across education. So we don't know how many children get identified for SEN support after acquiring a brain injury because we can't even look for the children with brain injury in that data. If they do get support, we don't know what categories they're receiving support under and where they go. And then we don't know anything about their outcomes. If they're excluded, if they're persistently absent, we don't know if their attainment trajectories match up to their pre-injury attainment trajectories. We just have no information because this data is not recorded by the Department for Education. So to try and address some of these gaps, about a couple of years ago, we saw this opportunity to use eChild, which is a data set held by UCL, University College London, and it's really exciting. For the first time, it links hospital records with education data so that we can follow children after they've had contact with a hospital and see what happens to them in education afterwards. So we requested data relating to all children born between September 2003 and August 2004, so a whole birth cohort. Those children started reception in 2008, 2009. So we trawled through the reception records, the school censuses from that year, and pulled out all the children who were recorded in autumn, spring or summer that year. And we built this cohort of about 500,000 children. And that's a birth cohort, and that longitudinal data is really important, and we haven't really had any of that so far on brain injury. So then we needed to identify acquired brain injury in this data. There's a few approaches you can take in hospital episode statistics, and we decided to focus only on the admitted patient care data for a few reasons. One of which being, every time I talk about this project and talk about acquired brain injury with people who aren't expert in it and don't really know anything about it, people say to me, "Are you sure you're not over-identifying acquired brain injury? How do you know that if someone's had these conditions, they're actually going to go on to need support?" And that's one of the biggest questions. So I wanted to be really robust in knowing that the children that we're identifying really do need some ongoing support. I wanted to be quite conservative in that estimate. And we didn't use any A&E data because first of all, the diagnostic codes just aren't well recorded in A&E. All the clinicians we've spoken to have told us that it wouldn't really be worthwhile going through. And secondly, children who attend A&E with head injuries, we heard earlier about the CT scans, actually only a small proportion will have a TBI that will then lead to really ongoing difficulties and need ongoing support. So we're being very conservative in that measure, using the admitted patient care data only. And when we did look in at admitted patient care data, this is the sort of table breaking down how many children had had a stay in hospital for any of these conditions. So you can see we've broken down sort of stroke, meningitis, brain tumour, encephalitis, cerebral abscess, all the way through to show you the kind of incidence rates in our birth cohort of 500,000 children. And these are hospital episodes before they turned 18. So they've had these at some point in their childhood. There's a couple of notes. Firstly, on TBI, this has given us such a headache trying to categorise TBI from ICD-10 codes. So we've made a pretty confident TBI group, which uses the intracranial injury codes and the codes for the consequences of intracranial injury. So we're pretty confident that those children have got TBI. And then we've also created a possible TBI group, which includes things like skull fractures and crushing injuries to the head and neck, things that realistically we think might lead to TBI, but we don't have that confirmation in the intracranial injury code. So that we've got a much more conservative group, which we're really confident in, and then this wider group, which includes another 11,000 children, where we think there might be a TBI. They've experienced a major trauma, but we're not sure if it's led to TBI. The other category includes a range of conditions like cerebral edema, toxic encephalopathy, and then the other question mark is around hydrocephalus. So we pulled that out because it was of interest, but we've sort of since been back into it and had another look at it. There were 292 children who had hydrocephalus associated with an ABI code, so maybe they had a TBI and then they had hydrocephalus associated with that. So we've kept them in the sample, but they'll appear in other categories as well. We've removed those children with neonatal hydrocephalus before 28 days. There were 14 of them, and that's because that wouldn't really be considered an acquired injury. It would be a sort of congenital condition. And we've removed those with hydrocephalus that wasn't associated with another ABI code, because that could be from something like cystic fibrosis or another condition that would lead to hydrocephalus. So hopefully that makes sense as to how we've categorised it, but this was really, really complicated. So yeah, and I have the code lists with the ICD-10 codes as well. If anyone else is working in hospital data, let's share what we've been doing. So the headline findings then in terms of incidence. If we take that broader group, including the sort of trauma injuries, the skull fractures and things, the bigger group, we found that just under 15,000 children had had an ABI before they turned 18, an admitted patient care episode for ABI, so really quite serious conditions. So that's 1 in 38 children. That's one child in every class, maybe every 2 classes, has had an ABI. And if we take our more conservative estimate and we remove those possible TBIs, we find just under 5,000 children, which is 1 in 122 children. And so that's, in a secondary school, 1 child in every year group who have an acquired brain injury that we're really confident is going to lead to ongoing needs. And that's about the same prevalence as something like autism spectrum disorders. There's also this patterning by child poverty as well for ABI. So out of the entire sample, about 33% were eligible for free school meals at any time before age 18. And that's an index sort of assessed by family benefits eligibility, but it acts as a function of absolute poverty and quite a conservative measure of absolute poverty as well. But if we look in our ABI groups, the number's about the same, whether we use the conservative group or the wider group. It's about 41% of children who live in poverty that have an ABI. So ABI is disproportionately affecting children who are already disadvantaged. Then we looked at SEND support. And as I said, these findings are quite preliminary, but SEND support in the data is split into these 3 levels. So they've either never had any identified SEN, nothing recorded. They've had SEN support, which is kind of just done in schools. It's all sort of changed in 2014-15 as well, which is a bit confusing. But they can have this sort of second level where the SEN's been identified by the school, but it's not got the extra funding and the education healthcare plans. And then they have that third level, which is more intense support. So in our more conservative ABI group, those children that we're really confident have got an ABI leading to ongoing difficulties, 41% had never been identified for SEND support at any point in their school career. And to me, I think that's absolutely massive. A further 37% had had SEND support needs identified, and then only 22% had an EHCP. And 13 had spent time in an SEN unit as well. In our wider group, that number becomes even higher. So just under half, 49%, had never had any identified special educational needs at any point in their school career. 39% had SEND support, and then 12% had an EHCP. I also just had a quick look to see what categories of support children were receiving support under, because this is a complete unknown. This was just a snapshot from 2019, and that's when these children were about 16. So I tried to get something towards the end of the data just to give us a snapshot idea of where these children might be. But I'm going to go back and do this in a bit of a better, more systematic way, but just to give you an idea. It looks like most children are receiving support under social, emotional, and mental health difficulties or moderate learning difficulties. But actually, it's really quite widely spread. So there's 200 with severe learning difficulties, 456 with specific learning difficulties, which are things like dyslexia would go under specific learning difficulties. So you can see there's this really widespread as to where children are receiving their support. There's obviously a huge to-do list as the things we'd like to do next, including having a look at how many of those children started receiving their SEND provision after they had their ABI. So if we go back to that table, I think some of these children will have been identified for needs early on in their school career and then maybe had an ABI after that, and the SEND support may not have changed. So that just makes our SEND estimate even more conservative, really. But I'd like to go back and have a look at the temporal order of that. And kind of establish whether children with ABI are more vulnerable to school exclusion. That's our next big question. Whether receiving SEND support changes that trajectory, is protective against school exclusion. And then see whether those socio-demographic differences in poverty and gender and things impact who gets identified for SEND support and who gets excluded from school. So in conclusion, I know that the others in this symposium are going to give you fantastic arguments about ABI being a SEND category in the school census. I think it's really, really important. Given the high prevalence, even our most conservative estimate of 1 in 122 children, that's really, really prevalent, and the complete lack of insight that we currently have into their outcomes. We're missing the opportunity to provide support for almost half of children with acquired brain injury in school, and that's going to have this long-lasting impact on their outcomes in education, but also later in life as well. Success at school is really, really important. We also urgently need more training for SENCOs and teachers so that they can recognise ABI and build this kind of wraparound support system for children when they come out of hospital. And I also will just finish on this question of prevention as well. If we know that children who live in poverty are more vulnerable to ABI, and there are other studies that have found that as well, and child poverty is arguably a political choice. There's not really any reason in this country why children should be so impacted by poverty and their outcomes should be so much worse. Then policies addressing child poverty could also act as preventative public health policies for preventing ABI as well. And so I'm going to leave my email address up there. As I said, this project's ongoing and I would really love to hear from anybody who's interested and wants to talk about it. So please do get in touch. But I'm also now going to hand over to the wonderful Joanna Woodhouse, who is a SENCO and a member of the Enables Network, who's going to tell us about teachers' perspectives on these problems. So,